Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Hashtag Product Design podcast. I'm joined today by none other than Sarrah Vesselov, and we'll be covering the topics of why designers need to be in tune with business needs as much as user needs and the current hesitancy in today's design market. Sarrah, absolute pleasure to have you on. Could you please just start by sharing us a quick intro into your career so far?
Oh boy. Oh, wow. I wasn't prepared. So currently I am the director of design for Honeycomb, which is observability strictly in that DevOps super technical space, which is where I've spent most of my career. Before that, I was at CloudBees, and before that at GitLab, where I ran design teams. So I've been doing that for a really long time. Management and building strong design teams is really like the space I love to be in. Also really big into design systems, read a book about it.
Yeah.
It's an area that I really care about. I think for me, it's all about creating the user experience and that atmosphere for the team. I've kind of like the meta of user experience.
Yeah, cool. For those watching, what's the book called that you wrote?
Building design systems. I do know the name of my book, I swear. Building Design Systems.
No worries. Well, look, send me the link after this, and I'll share it in the comments when we share it, so people can navigate to it. But look, obviously, again, pleasure to have you on the podcast. For those of you who are listening, we were at the same conference back in September at the Hatch conference. However, we didn't get the chance to officially meet then. But of course, we got in contact after, and I really wanted you to jump on and speak about the topics that we've got on task for today. Obviously, for those who have watched the previous ones, generally there's two main topics that we'll cover off throughout the podcast. I've switched it up a little bit for this part of the series of the podcast I did last year. I think we did 10 episodes last year, actually, and I think this is the 11th episode, as I said in the intro. But this time I wanted to give some ownership over to the guest as much as I possibly could, to try and pick and choose a topic that was personal to them, but a hot topic that they wanted to speak about. And of course, you came up with the topic as why designers need to be in tune with business needs as much as they do with user needs. So do you want to just give us a quick intro into the topic and why you thought it was important to speak about it today?
Well, gosh, I think there's a lot of different reasons. I think personally, I think it's what held me back in my own career for quite a while, and so I think that it's important. I don't want others to be held back. Trying to help others learn from my mistakes. And it's not that I don't understand business. I have an MBA, but I had in my mind kind of separated the business from design. I really saw design as a craft and being about the user, being the voice of the user. And I kind of took that business savvy and knowledge and put it out of my mind as I was working throughout my career. And I kept hitting this wall of kind of managing up is what they call it, right? When you're talking to whether it's a VP of product or engineering or even your CEO, it's like we weren't speaking the same language. And I knew that I cared about the business and I cared about the numbers, but I was speaking from a place of craft and quality and design. And they were just like, what is this? Like, this person does not understand what we're trying to do here. And I'm like, but I do. And it was only when I was able to start leading with how this is going to have an outcome and impact on the business that they started really listening, and that I started to have more of an impact for my team, right? And at the end of the day, we all want to have an impact and we all want to make a difference. And I think that if it really is a matter of changing language, it's so easy, right? It's just kind of that perspective shift. So.
Yeah, for sure. No, I completely understand what you're saying. I think we'll go into further detail a bit. I mean, your sort of existing experience with your own team and people you potentially look to hire as well. But I think you highlighted it as a problem that some of the designers you speak to really focus on being as quality focused and presenting as best design as possible and things like that. But understanding business needs is as equally as important as understanding user needs, because of course you're trying to push the business forwards, and the business really wants to excel and of course make money at the end of the day as well. But I know in terms of design, of course it's a creative space, right? But it's not necessarily art, as I know you've said before.
Yeah.
So how would you describe it from your perspective?
Well, I think that's a big. So yeah, I mean, it sounds harsh when I say design isn't art,
Mm,
but I think that design is there to support the business through a combination of focusing on the user, making sure that user needs are met, and that we are listening and hearing and understanding that problem, and then using our craft. Right, that's the artistic part. That's the
mm,
part that probably many of us fell in love with and are like, how are we going to use this love of our artistic nature, um, to, I mean, let's be real, to have a living, to make money, right? I
mm.
started out in fine arts and very quickly was like, I'm never going to make money glass
Yeah.
blowing and
Yeah.
like, what the heck am I doing here?
Yeah.
And so I switched to design because design is a way to apply that to business.
Mm,
And so I think that to me, design is all about functioning on that space between um, uh, functionality and beauty. Like there's
yeah.
it's this really odd, it's like the difference between a chair and a chair that you're like, oh wow, that
Yeah.
chair.
Yeah.
I want
Yes.
I want to sit in that chair. I want to
Yeah.
buy that chair.
Mm,
And I think that that's what a lot of us are really striving for.
mm,
Um, but we forget that, you know, we have we have to focus on the intersection between our design aspirations, right? That chair that we want people to
yeah.
buy, and the reality of the business that your design is supporting, at the end of the day. And I think there's this attitude that I've had. I'm not gonna lie, I've had like, oh, I'm cheating my users, or I'll never be able to put this in my portfolio. I'll never be able to show this.
Mm,
Like, I don't want anyone to know that I designed this. And I think that that's a shame to look at it this way.
yeah.
You are working within a set of constraints, right? It could be time, it could be the technology. Often it's time and technology,
Yeah.
right? You don't have time to refactor and to go back, and so you kind of have this limited set, and it's really often about getting it out there so that you can get feedback from the user, right? You're not
Mm,
developing something and designing something in this
yeah.
like space where you're in an echo chamber, because maybe you're going to develop something and design something that's absolutely beautiful and
Mm,
completely unusable.
yeah.
And so, yeah, it's going to look, welcome to dribble, right? You're going to have this great,
Yeah.
beautiful thing that, like, when you
Yeah.
really start using it, is like, it's not really that usable. So I think that's where I'm trying to help a lot of my designers get to, is that it's okay to have two quality bars. Um, the quality bar that you have for when it's really about getting it out there to get feedback and
Mhm.
to iterate and make it
Mm,
better, and that quality bar for when you're working on a really mature feature and it's something where it's already out there, you've got lots of feedback, and it's time to really refine it and make it shine.
yeah.
And being okay with that.
Yeah.
That was a
No,
really long answer, sorry.
no, that's totally fine. Yeah, look, I really like the comparison you made in terms of, the two chairs that you want to buy, or the two chairs you're looking at. Essentially they have the same function, right? You're going to sit on them. But
Yeah,
generally when it's the same with any item really. If you're looking for
yeah,
any like handbag or anything, generally the designer handbags are the ones you want, right? But
yeah,
why is that? And essentially you're trying to create the same with the design on digital products. Is you want people to want to buy this over the competition, or want to buy this over others. And how do we do that?
right, right.
I think I wanted to discuss a topic that I think is quite it's certainly relevant to what you said before, in terms of course, you have to try and find those two separate, the balance between the two quality bars that you mentioned. Now, the topic I wanted to sort of cover off was assumption, right? I think assumption, certainly from me speaking to a lot of designers, I think it is situational based, it is circumstantial, but um, I think most designers would want to believe that we should just interact with the users. We should do user research, user testing, interviews, etc., to really try and understand what they want and iterate and then retest and things like that. But
Yeah,
I guess, what would your advice be if someone, let's say someone doesn't have resources, or the company doesn't have the time or money, for instance, to invest in research and things like that. how how detrimental can assumption be in a design process when you're building features and building new products?
I mean, let's be real. I think the majority of people that I interview and that I talk to are working in an environment where their interaction with users is pretty minimal,
Mm,
and they're really not getting that ability to jump in and talk to people. I've
yeah,
been very, very lucky. I mean, I worked at GitLab,
yeah,
which was open source, and we had, I mean, it
yeah,
was easy to interact. And then, and the same with CloudBees. And now currently we have a Slack channel. So, I mean, we have a UX feedback.
mm,
So I'm daily getting feedback, and
yeah,
then I can ask questions and we can do polls.
yeah,
For those that don't have that environment, I think that they definitely feel like they're at a disadvantage, and they're not
mm,
learning and they're not growing like some of their peers. But you're in the majority. I think you're in the majority of designers that are often working in a 1 or 2 person shop, not reporting to a design manager,
mm,
really being scrappy. And I think assumption assumption is where all things start, right? You start with an assumption, you start with a
yeah,
hypothesis. Um, and I think that as long as you maintain that mode, that's okay.
mm,
As long as you don't get to that point where you're like, this is it, that it doesn't
yeah,
become too precious, right? And
mm,
you don't fall in love with your
yeah,
own design.
mm,
I- Because there is going to be that point where you put it out and you're going to get that feedback.
mm,
And if you are defensive about that feedback, or you can't hear it,
yeah,
then that's when assumption becomes detrimental.
mm,
And I think that's when you run into issues.
yeah,
And I've seen that as well. I've worked with um, some people that have just uh, not even cared about talking to users, and have been like, this is it,"
yeah. This is
and I'm
it.
like, "That is
Yeah,
not it."
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah.
Following on from that, why do you think um, certain businesses, certain product teams don't value the discovery or conception phase as much as they should? Is it time? Is it resources?
It's time. It's
Yeah.
always
Mm,
time. I really think it's always time. Even everywhere I've been, and I get it. Like, I'm a business owner myself. I run a business outside of my
mm,
my day job, and there's a lot of pressure, and I can't imagine if I was running this business with the need to raise funding and with the
mm,
need to have others invest, and then being held accountable for those investments, right?
yeah.
I'm just using up my savings, right? I'm just
Yeah.
going to end up
Yeah.
living in a shack at the end of my life.
Yeah.
Like, that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
But so if you and I often encourage my designers to think of it from that perspective, because there's this feeling of they don't value research, they don't value, and it's not that at all. It's about making design bets. If you can look at it as, we're trying to make bets as quickly as we can. um, and I like to look at it as bets, because it's, if that when you make bets, you're going to lose some, you're going to win some, right?
Mhm.
So if you look at it that way, one, that makes it a little bit easier when you lose some. You can kind of shrug it off and keep moving. Makes it that much more exciting when you win.
Yeah.
And then you can also see that the stakes aren't as high, because when you see it that way, it's okay to roll something out when it's not perfect. That's that lower quality bar. And you can get that feedback and
Mm.
hopefully iterate on it in these short cycles. And I know that a lot of time you're like, but there's never time, right? They say that we're going to make it better, and then we never
Mm.
make it better. I understand. It's another problem for another
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
But if you can start shifting that conversation from we don't value it to we don't have time for it, and starting to find ways to make time,
Mm.
to start just broadening that gap and saying, okay, we don't have time for this for a whole, discovery doesn't have to take a month.
Mm.
Discovery could take a day.
Yeah.
Discovery could take a few hours. You're doing something, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Mm.
And I think that that's the mindset a lot of designers have to have. And I see a lot of this conversation that happens,
Yeah.
um, and a lot of it is this very black and white. And I'm like, there's like a whole gray area in there that nobody's
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a common problem. Obviously, I speak to probably hundreds of designers per month. and it's certainly a common problem. I think a lot of them want to be, or as close to be in a position where they do have, the full scope, budget, time to really delve deeper and do continuous discovery and keep trying to understand what the user wants, how they can improve things. But as you said, time is not necessarily of the essence. I think particularly in like fast-paced startups, right? I think when you want to release something quick and you want to get something out quickly, unfortunately you don't have the time. So as you said, you've got to try and come up with a solution.
Yeah.
What you mentioned about design bets sounds like a pretty good good solution.
Yeah. And I would also say that that dream of, right, like where, oh, I have all this time, and that's a lot of time that's called waterfall, and
Yeah.
that dream dies too. Like, I'm not gonna, like, let's be real, like at least often in these short agile cycles, your work is actually getting out to people. Often in these longer, bigger companies that have these really long cycles and they have many, many teams, sometimes what you design and you put together and you spend 2 years working on never gets to anybody.
Mm.
It just gets killed.
Yeah.
And so there are trade-offs to those two different systems. I think it's really about what you are comfortable working in, and as somebody that always works in startups, I love that, like, go, go, go.
Yeah.
I'm a doer.
Yeah.
I'm always looking for people that are comfortable with those shorter cycles and can be scrappy
Yeah.
about because they have to be, right? You
Yeah,
just
for
have to
sure.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, essentially the quicker you can release something to get feedback from it, the quicker you know whether it's the right thing or whether you're even down the right page
Yeah.
at all, right? If you're
Yeah.
putting together a new feature, or there's a problem with one of your features already. If you spend a month, for instance, trying to
Yeah.
understand what the problem is, and then you release something it's not right, then of course you're a month further down the line when
Yeah.
had you done it a bit quicker, or just tried to at least get some form of feedback a bit quicker, then you might have been a bit further along.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to the original topic in a bit more detail in terms of the difference between user needs and business needs. Now, what advice would you give designers? Often there's potentially friction between these two things, right? Because the business might want to go one direction, the users might want to go down another. So, what advice would you give designers who are maybe fighting the same battles that you've had to fight in terms of proving why their work and their design and what the user wants is the right way to go? What advice would you give to designers who are fighting that battle at the moment?
Yeah. I think, gosh, I have so many ideas in my head right now. We're all fighting that. First off, say we're all
Yeah,
fighting the same battles. Like,
yeah,
I've been doing this so long, and it's the same battle every place, all the time,
mm,
everywhere. And I think that the situations are different based on the people involved, the culture involved, the type of product. So I think those are the pieces that change, but
mm,
it's always going to be the same battles, and it's always going to be somewhat the same conversations, right? And I think that as designers, as a manager, what I try to do is I try to give as much context to what's happening up top, so that they have the ability to tie these decisions and these design arguments,
mm,
right? Like, we think this solution makes more sense than this, to what's actually happening at the business right now. So if our focus is on acquisitions, right, and getting people through that
mm,
onboarding and signing up and say getting data in, then I can help my designers make arguments that support that push, right? That idea. You don't want to be advocating for something that goes against what the strategy is at this time.
sure.
And
Mm,
you think that seems like logical, but I
yeah.
see it all the time,
Mhm.
right? I see it all the time. And I think that's one big piece, is just making sure that you really understand what the strategy of the company is. You
Mm,
understand the ecosystem. Where does money come in? What are the different? Is it free?
mm,
Is it enterprise? Like, what are the different tiers you have,
yeah.
and what area are you responsible for? So when you're thinking about those things, it's even important to understand how your decisions affect cost. So you may make a decision of, oh, well, if a user comes in, they can do X, Y, Z. Well, perhaps that's going to raise our cost, how much it costs us to run
Mm,
this, by X amount, and lower our per user.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand these things. And if you don't ask,
Mm.
there's so many people in the company that you can leverage and talk
Yeah.
to and to understand these things. And they love to talk about it. Believe me,
Yeah.
like they love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Definitely. No, I agree with you. I think there is certainly, people within the business who are more on the business side than a designer might be, and they might,
Yeah.
designers might not necessarily have a clear understanding of, how this business runs, why, how they make money, why they do, have built the products that they've built essentially. But do you think there is a little bit of a case to say that some businesses and products, certainly from top down, are not necessarily transparent enough with their product vision and roadmap for the
Oh
design
yeah.
team? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the ones that aren't as transparent, it they're not as clear themselves. I really
Mm.
think that's what's going
Yeah.
on. I
Yeah.
think really that's what's
Mm.
happening. They just don't know. They're kind of going between like, we think this or we think
Mm.
this, or you've got, and that's a whole other thing
Mm.
altogether. But uh yeah, and that's something to look for as a designer. When
Mm.
when you're interviewing somewhere and you're talking, like if they can't articulate a clear strategy,
Mm.
and a clear roadmap for where they want to go. And I mean, it depends on the where the company is and
Yeah.
but most companies can say, well, this is where we are and this is where we want to
Mm.
go. That's something you can grab onto and start to use, um, to help the business. I mean, it's to your own advantage.
Yeah.
There's just this interesting thing I see happen sometimes. Is it's almost, it reminds me of like teenagers, right? Like, I don't want to sell out. Like, I don't want to sell out. And I'm like, you're not selling out, right? You're
Yeah.
you're taking this knowledge and you're using it to be the voice of the user,
Mm.
right? Because users are deciding between you and competitors,
Yeah.
and that's the whole purpose of welcome to capitalism. That's the whole purpose of the
Yeah.
marketplace. And
Yeah.
so I just try to be real about it.
Mm.
And I think that the more you can ground those arguments, in in metrics, in KPIs, in the language of
Mm.
the business, the more sense you're going to make and the faster
Yeah.
it's going to be to get those things out, versus them sitting around until all of a sudden, we've all had this experience. We have an idea, maybe we do
Mm.
a mock-up, and but we explain about how it's going to make this more usable and da, 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 da.
Mm.
And then nothing happens, and 6 months later, a product person or a 10x engineer is like, wait a minute, I have an idea. And you're like, you mean this idea that I had,
Yeah.
but they're explaining it in business terms,
Yeah.
you know? And so the faster we can make those connections, the better we can advocate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really like that actually. I think as design progresses, it certainly becomes a lot more about business understanding and things like that. And I think if you're really trying to explain, or come up with an idea and explain that to C-level, to managers, to whoever you need to try and explain it to justify it. I think certainly when you're talking to more of the business side, you need to be able to explain it from a business perspective and how that's going to impact in a positive way, and have
Yeah.
potentially have as much data to back that up as well.
Yeah.
Numbers speak volumes at the end of the day, and if you can back it up with data, of course, do so. One thing you mentioned there, of course, was about competitors. Now, obviously, from speaking to designers, generally, well, researchers or designers, part of that process is competitor analysis, right? Um,
Mhm.
how much focus do you think there should be, when you're conducting research, to really analyze your competitors or what they're doing? And also, do you think, I think a problem has been that some businesses see competitors doing it, like I'm saying, from the top down, not necessarily designers, but some
Yeah.
businesses see what they're doing that, so we're going to do that. We're going to put it in our app. What's your opinion on that topic?
Oh yeah, it's so interesting how I've come around on this. Earlier in my career, because of that phenomenon, which we've all experienced, of
Yeah.
like, look, just make it look like this, right? And you're like, oh my god, like they don't have the same user base, like it's not the same flow into it and the same flow out of it. I can't just make it look like that. It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
Um, However, so I used to really just get so frustrated and kind of avoid it. Um, and did myself a disservice, I think, as a
Yeah.
designer. I think it's really important to have your eyes on competitors and understand. Um, but again, I do it less so from the, and maybe that's because again, I'm in a management position
Yeah.
and no longer doing IC work.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, often what I'm doing is I'm looking at them and thinking, that's interesting. Why'd they make that choice? Are they shifting the market they're going after? Are
Mm.
they shifting their tactics? Are they shifting their pricing plan? Like, I'm thinking about those things
Yeah.
because that has a big effect on so many things in the market and on your position in it. And um, I think that that is something that designers should at least have an idea is
Mm.
happening, um, because well, that and it helps you have an answer for when someone inevitably comes and says, "Why don't we just make it look like this
Yeah.
feature in this?"
Yeah.
I think that then you can say, "Ah, that's," again, you're gonna devil's advocate. "Oh, that's fantastic. That's really interesting. Uh, however," and then you can start kind of picking away at
Mm.
how different that experience is because it's for a different audience or it's for a different
Yeah.
set of people. Um, and then obviously whatever crossover there is, you can take learnings from that.
Yeah.
So I really think that it's useful in that way, and it helps you kind of keep tabs on, if you see two or three competitors suddenly make really interesting shifts.
Yeah.
Did we miss something?
Yeah. What have they
Like
got that
it's
we haven't? Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So I
Yeah.
think it's really important to like
Yeah.
keep an eye on those things,
Yeah.
in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think of course the points you make are really relevant. I think it's important for designers not to immediately assume, oh, they're doing this, so we must have to do it, let's go and build it straight away. I think it's, of course, as you mentioned, it's, as soon as it has been noticed and it's seen, do some thorough research into why this is happening. What are they actually trying to achieve by this, and will it benefit us? Of
Yeah.
course, the board and the C level will of course appreciate if you have noticed it, and of course it would benefit them by doing it. But you've got to try and understand and delve a bit deeper into it before you start looking at doing it as well. Cool. Now I wanted to go on to the second topic that we wanted to cover off in today.
Yeah.
Now, this topic is really relevant in today's market.
Mm.
As a recruiter, unfortunately, probably 80 to 90% of the conversations I'm having with designers at the moment are some who have been laid off recently from companies or have left company to join another company and contracts been rescinded or taken away before they've even got to join the business. So it's a really, really tough market at the moment. But I think it's a really relevant topic to talk about. So first question I wanted to ask you, why do you think there are so many layoffs happening at the moment?
Well, I mean, markets. Um, and I talk to a lot of designers that really don't. They and a lot of people, but I would say, designers especially. This- if we're talking about shares and
Mm,
compensation, and they're like, I don't
yeah.
understand anything about stocks. I don't
Mm,
understand. You really need to. You really need to.
yeah.
It's a bargaining chip. It's a bargaining point. But also understanding why markets go up and down. Um, and being able to anticipate a little bit this kind of up and down will help you in the long term.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people saw this coming because things were so bullish for so long.
Mm.
Um, Even though things weren't that great, we're like, there's this strange sense of false optimism happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people are hiring, even
Mm,
though the numbers weren't that good
yeah.
across. And so I think a lot of us were like, yeah, it's inevitably this bubble will
Yeah.
burst.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing as people finally realize that, you can't live on hopes and dreams. Money has to follow. And
Mm,
so what's happened is a lot of investors have started getting nervous with inflation and with the things going on in economies, and you've got
Mm.
wars, and you've got
Yeah.
instability in the
Yeah.
U.S. political sphere, which I will not go into.
Yeah.
Um, all of these things make a
Yeah.
difference, and so what people are doing is they're playing it safe and they're being more conservative. So
Mm.
less money is being invested in certain areas, and so companies are tightening their purse strings.
Mm.
The number one cost of any company is going to be their employees, their
Yeah.
workforce.
Mm.
I know this myself. It's unbelievable.
Mm.
If I didn't have to pay employees,
Yeah.
for my own business, I could run it indefinitely.
Yeah.
But so that's the number one place that you can immediately cut costs and see a difference
Mm.
and extend out your runway. So you're looking at a lot of companies that rely on VC funding, that rely
Mhm.
on money coming in. They have what they call a runway, right? That's an amount of money that you
Yeah.
have raised, and then you have a certain amount of time till that money just runs out.
Yeah.
And hopefully, most businesses they have a good CFO who's done due
Mm.
diligence and really calculating that out. I would not want to be that person.
No, yeah, me neither.
No
Yeah,
thanks.
do not envy them whatsoever.
No, but calculating that out, and
Yeah.
as you start to get closer to that date, you have to start dropping things so that you can
Mm.
extend that date out. So that's
Yeah.
what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, though, is that there are a lot of um, VCs that want to invest, so there is a lot of investing going on, but it's
Mm.
it's going on at the much earlier stage startups.
Mm.
So you're seeing, I think, this fear, the money coming out of the Twitters and Metas and all of these bigger companies that are doing layoffs. The boon is going to the small startups,
Mm.
because they don't need as much. They're really scrappy, and they're there to disrupt the markets that are now proving to be
Yeah.
maybe not performing as well. So
Mm.
it's this cycle, um, that
Yeah.
people just have to kind of like. It sucks to be in it, but I think also you just kind of have to take a deep breath and realize that it's going to come back up.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I think,
Yeah,
yeah, I really agree with everything you said. I think obviously the main market I recruit in is in Berlin now. I think
yeah,
obviously similar to Silicon Valley and things like that, there are a lot of startups that get
yeah,
founded in Berlin. And I agree with you. I think certainly the ones that we've seen who have been doing the most layoffs are those startups that are probably like Series C, Series D, something like that, who have already, received quite, substantial venture capital, and off the back of that, probably gone through some form of hypergrowth phase in the last, year or two.
yeah,
But of course, with investors being a little bit more hesitant, a bit more cautious about what they're investing in, and I think just because of the downturn, because of the inflation, financial markets, essentially most of these digital companies are selling things, right? Selling products. And if
hmm
companies, the general wealth of the world or market that they're in is decreasing, and less people are buying their
yeah,
product or wanting to use their product, of course the revenue that was hoped to be made by that point from the investors' perspective it was probably a lot less than they originally sort of pitched it to be.
yeah,
And that being said, as you said, as soon as they run out of that runway and they're like, well, we grew this amount, but we haven't really quite hit our like user targets, or we haven't quite made the revenue targets or whatever we were set. Then of course, as you said, the first place they go to is, right, we're going to have to get rid of pretty much everyone we hired before, and just
yeah,
look to sort of increase runway and start again a little bit. But we've still got the work they've done over the last year or two.
yeah,
But yeah, in terms of hypergrowth, this is obviously again, I think a big reason as to why we are seeing so many layoffs at the moment, specifically in the startup world, I would say,
yeah,
because I think it's been such a common theme that, as I said, when people probably like 2021, maybe start of 2022, companies who announced big rounds of funding, then thought, well, we've got a real chance to grow here and invest a lot of money into growing as well. I've spoken to lots of people. I've spoken to hiring managers as well who've been the hiring managers in the hypergrowth phase, and they've all said similar things as to, because the growth is so aggressive, quality was often sacrificed for quantity of just bringing people in because we needed to, because that's what we've told investors that we're going to do, or the directors decided that that's what we're going to do now.
mhm.
Why do you think hypergrowth and that type of approach was so common, like and it's, it's probably still common, maybe not so much now, but like certainly over the last few years, it's been the common way to use the investment that they've received from these venture capital partners.
God, I've thought about this before, and I experienced this at GitLab
Yeah.
when they got there. I think it was the Series D. Can't even remember. I mean, it's like everything exploded, and it was
Yeah.
like, well, where am I even? Um, eh, and that's part of why I'm still where I'm at after 3 years. I mean,
Mm.
3 years at a startup is like, whew, I'm getting a little old. I think I need a cane at this point. I'm like, I've been here a while. But because I really like the fact that we're very careful and we're very, you know, pragmatic about things.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that it's that mythical man uh, idea. We've all been on the project
Mm.
where they're like, if we just bring in one more person, we can get X amount done. And it's like, no, actually, you're just going to make it that much slower because we're all going to have to get slower
Yeah.
to onboard this person
Mm.
and explain everything that we all already have in our heads.
Mm.
If you would actually just give us less meetings and more focus time,
Yeah.
we would get more done. And I think that's what's happening at a lot of
Mm.
these companies. There's this idea. And I think there's definitely areas of a company that need more people.
Mm.
I've seen it many times where you've got one area that you're hyper growing and you're
Mm.
slowing everybody down because you're doing interviewing and you're onboarding and you can't move as fast because you're kind of dragging everybody slower. And then seeing these scrappy, particularly in areas like marketing, for some reason, you've got a team of two people trying to run like the most unbelievable amount of stuff, and you're like, why are what you know
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that this is a systematic problem in startups, and I often wonder, I don't have enough. I'm not high enough up to understand like where this comes from,
Mm.
in terms of like where the allocation
Yeah.
happens, and where they decide. But it seems
Yeah.
to me it's often in engineering,
Yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
design that
Yeah.
they think they're going to get the most bang for their
Mm.
buck. And often I think that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, for sure. No, I agree. I think most hypergrowth phases that I've seen or even been a part of with some of the clients that I've worked with, engineering definitely is probably the, like, obviously I don't know necessarily for the other parts of the business, but certainly in
Yeah.
tech,
Hmm.
engineering is always the department that goes boom,
I know.
doubles, triples, and then
Yeah.
yeah, I think some get to a certain point, they're like, well, we've got 60 engineers now. We probably need some product managers and designers to work with them, right? So then they go boom with them too.
Exactly.
But yeah, and
Yeah.
then as I said, I think the quality was always the problem, certainly with the people that I've spoken to have hired during this phase, because yeah, there's just pressure on them. There's pressure to hire.
Yeah.
A lot of, much to my demise and frustration, a lot of the clients I work with are quite picky about who they want, but I completely
Yeah.
respect and understand where that comes from, because of course
Right.
I think everyone knows that making the wrong hire costs a lot more,
Yes.
than making the right one if you take a little bit more time.
Yeah.
But then yeah, generally during the hypergrowth phase, and this, I think there's such a problem with turnover during those phases as well, right? Staff turnover, people come in, it's hectic. It's, I've got 6 different managers in the first 6 months. What's happening? I'm
Yeah.
teams 3 different times already, and then it entail becomes a lot of a turnover situation. It's very hard to retain staff at that point because you get the sort of reputation. Everyone knows, design's a
Yeah.
small place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then it's about culture too, because most companies, I mean, in my experience, most companies, engineering is the most mature because you
Mm.
start with,
Yeah.
founders, some engineers, and they're like,
Yeah.
design, whatever, product, whatever. They come in later.
Yeah.
And so you get into a situation as well where they think they're going to get in, and I've been this person, they think they're going to get in a senior IC designer who's going to build out a team. And within 6 months, they're going to have the most unbelievable, delightful, beautiful UI they've ever had.
Mm.
And it's like, I really hate to break it to you, but it takes time and it takes a lot more than one person
Yeah.
or five people. Um, it's about growing the maturity of that part of the org. And if they come in at different times and different rates, then you've got these kind of unequal parts, and it's just
Yeah.
it's a real cluster.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Now, when it comes to funding and raising investment, of course, as I said, Berlin is a very startup hub. There's lots of startups that still propping up now. Most weeks, most months, there's new companies coming out. Now, when a new company is looking to receive investment, if they're going to go down that route, which most companies do, right? Most companies do look for outside investment. It's very rare to see a company that hasn't been, received any outside investment in its time. But when they are looking to raise this investment, when they go to the investors and sort of pitch to them and say, this is our company, this is what we're hoping to do, what are the main things that investors look at with their business to say, yeah, this is worth investing in at that point?
Oh boy, there's a few, and I won't go too deep because
Yeah.
you start your eyes glaze over. At
Yeah.
least mine do.
Yeah.
And this is the thing about business metrics, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have to become a mathematician, right? But you do have to understand the basics of what these things mean, and how your work can have an impact on these
Yeah.
numbers. I think that's the most important part. I mean, the first thing, and this goes into our talk about competitors, is um, how crowded is the market? If you're too niche, right, and it's just a very small segment that's not likely to grow over time, eh, that's not a place to invest your money,
Yeah.
right? It's really, there's not a large potential for that. So I think a lot of investors are looking for something new, something different, that is going to come in and disrupt. I hate using that word. I feel like I should be in a TED talk right now.
Yeah.
But that are gonna disrupt and
Yeah.
make an impact. I honestly, at this point, like, I don't even know what that would look like. I feel like everything's been done.
Yeah.
Um,
I know.
so I don't know, but that's why it's important to understand your competitors and the marketplace and what's out there. If you're a company that's establishing something new, you're kind of forging a new path off of something that is kind of old and established. That's interesting to investors. That's like,
Mm.
this is really interesting. They could
Yeah.
really be putting something new, or it could be seen as niche, right? You really have
Mm.
to have a good CEO who knows how to pitch it and spin it in a way that's exciting and seems like something that really could grow. So I
Mm.
think that's really important, especially in the beginning. Um, and then you get into things depending on where you're at, like your run rate, total revenue. So what is the performance? Like how much money are you bringing in?
Yeah.
Um, I want to know, you know, understanding the current performance, and how much revenue you're generating, so that you can start making projections, right? So
Yeah.
if we were to get X amount more business, how could this revenue grow? Um, and another would be gross margin percentage. So
Yeah.
it's your total revenue
Yeah.
minus the cost of your operation,
Yeah.
right? A lot of startups are operating at there's no revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, let's be real. Like a
Yeah.
lot of them, there's no revenue. That's what's so different. Like I own a small business. I own like a physical cafe business,
Yeah.
and there is no funding for us. Like you have
Mm.
to be operating 3 years and actually have
Yeah.
a profit to even get a small business loan.
Yeah.
It's totally different from the startup world.
Yeah.
Um, but some other numbers that you can think about as a designer is the lifetime value of a customer,
Mm.
and then the customer acquisition cost. And so these are two numbers that I think are really important to think about. So lifetime value is like how much does a customer actually bring in? Like
Mm.
what's the lifetime value of a customer to the company?
Yeah.
Um, and then customer acquisition cost is how much does it cost us to bring someone in, right? And then you can actually do another number of how long does it take us to recover that. There's a name for that, and that one's escaping me right now.
Yeah.
But it might even they just might even use the same thing. They might just call it CAC.
Yeah.
You'll hear it called CAC a lot,
Yeah.
but basically it's like how long. And it's often it's something like 20 24 months 20, there's a time, I think anything under 2 years is considered to be good. Don't quote me, anybody out there. I might be wrong. I might be wrong. Look it
Yeah.
up. I have dyscalculia. I do look numbers up. So like all of these things, I think are, and you can look this up.
Yeah.
Like this is not something that you have to gone to school for. You know, you can look these things up, get familiar with the terms, and then find out from your own company, like what are the things that your company cares about? What
Yeah.
are the things that your company is really following right now? Because it's going to change over time depending on what series you're in, and what the market looks like.
Yeah.
So
Do you think, of course, you're talking about coming up with projections for the business. Now, I'd say, of course, when you receive that first round, or let's say you receive any round of investment, right? And you often, well, I assume you probably tell the investors, we're projecting this for by the next round or by X time or whatever it might be. Do you think misled projections sometimes lead to bad things happening?
oh god, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I have never been part of those conversations.
Yeah.
As a director, I'm managing managers and I'm managing ICs. I'm part of the conversations that help bolster those talks, which is fine by me.
Yeah.
Totally, I'm totally good with that.
Yeah.
But I think um, it's interesting. I use my own experience, running a small board game cafe where I'm having these conversations. And I'm very pragmatic. I'm very
Yeah.
straightforward. I'm not a bullshitter. And I've had conversations where they're like, "Well, give us projections, talking about loans or talking
Yeah.
about, borrowing money to help grow my business." And they're like, "Well, what do you project?" And, I'll throw something out there and they're like, "Sure, it's not more." And I'm like, I'm just, and I mean,
Yeah.
you literally are making things up.
Yeah.
And so I think there is a line between aspiration and reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some places, companies, people blur those lines a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable doing that. That's why I'm not a salesperson. I'm not a
Yeah.
salesperson.
Cool. Now, obviously going back to the design market, or the hiring market specifically. Of course, we determined in the previous conversation that it is a very hesitant market at this moment in time, and I think from both sides, right? It's hesitant. It's
Yeah.
hesitant. Yeah. Well, I think you've got three sides of it right now, haven't you? You've got hesitancy from companies to hire because they don't want to. They're really tightening their purse strings, as you mentioned. You've got hesitancy from passive candidates passive candidates. I'm talking about a recruiter. Passive designers. So used to saying it. Passive designers, who, and when I say passive, I mean the designers who right now aren't, looking for a new job hasn't really come across their
Right.
mind at this moment in time, right? I think there's always different levels of how passive and how active you really are, because I think often I speak to designers and say, are you looking for a new role at the moment, or are you just passively seeing what's out there? Like semi-actively, I'd say. Like, well, you are
Yeah.
then. But then of course you've got the designers who have been laid off now, so they're in a forced position now to look for new roles. Now, I wanted to ask what your advice is, for specifically for the laid off designers at the moment, because of course there are a lot of them now, and although some might be really talented and come from big tech companies, or come from really established businesses, or wherever they've come from, unfortunately they're now in a position where not only are they competing against the passive candidates that someone like myself has somehow managed to convince to look into something new, but they're now competing against the other hundreds of laid off designers, and it's become, I think, ever so more important to have a real priority to make sure your portfolio is up to date, make sure it looks good, make sure it's where it needs to be, and make sure your CV is all nice and done. What advice would you give to designers right now who have been laid off?
The first advice is don't panic. Don't panic. I think the and It's like telling someone who's mad to calm down, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't tell me to calm down.
Yeah.
Um, at least that's how I would respond.
Yeah.
Uh, um, but I think you know you've survived worse than this, and
Mm,
you'll be okay after this. When you start to panic and you start to get into that mode, one, you make bad decisions, and you don't want to end up in a place just to end up back in this position again, right? So you
mm,
don't want to end up, choosing a place either that isn't a good fit, so that you end up kind of on the
yeah.
other side real quickly, or um, choosing another place that is just going to go through another round of layoffs.
Mm,
So I think that it's really important to, as much as you can, take deep breaths and or whatever works for you.
mm.
I do boxing; that works for me,
Nice.
and, and that's my outlet.
Yeah.
And, and stay calm because, going into the interviews, I think the reason why often passive candidates have an advantage over candidates that don't have a job right now is passive candidates come across as more confident, because they don't care, right? They
Yeah.
have a job. They're
Yeah.
not desperate. They
Yeah.
don't feel this need to impress, or to be perfect,
Mm,
and they just present better because they're themselves,
yeah.
and they answer very honestly. And I see so many candidates who are so qualified and so awesome just flail because they're so nervous and they're so
Mm,
desperate, that they don't perform as well.
yeah.
Um, so I think that, as much as you can, to stay
Yeah.
calm. Um, and every hiring manager is different, every company is different,
Yeah.
and I see it out there. I see, for me, the portfolio, um, is not as important, but I'm not every hiring manager. I think,
Yeah.
I'm more interested in your process and how you approach things because I look at portfolios and of course I'm looking at the work, but I also recognize that a lot of the output comes through the lens of constraints and
Mm,
time and it's tough. And also working a full-time job, in design and keeping up with your portfolio.
yeah.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Like my portfolio is like ridiculous. It's so old.
Yeah.
Don't go look at it, anybody. Please do not go look at it.
Yeah.
You can just go look at my book instead.
Yeah.
Um, and management candidates, it's a whole other level. Like if you're a
Yeah.
manager, you're not doing IC work. And I see management candidates being asked for
Yeah, I know,
for
it's awesome.
IC, and I'm
Yeah.
like, what are you kidding me? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah,
would never ask for that.
yeah,
So I think that a lot of the pressure is ridiculous, and just remind yourself of that,
yeah,
because it'll help you. It will really
yeah,
help.
yeah. I just wanted to end on, Sarah, just, I know you mentioned when people were looking for a new job, something you mentioned earlier was that when they're speaking to a hiring manager or someone who's interviewing them, be sure to ask them about, what the product roadmap is and try and get a clear understanding of that. Um,
Yeah.
what other questions would you say are really effective to ask? If you were sitting across from me and I was, you're interviewing me, what questions would you like to hear from me? In terms of how I can understand whether this is the right opportunity for me or not, whether it's the right culture, design maturity. What questions would you advise people to ask during interviews to get an actual clear picture of whether this opportunity is right for them?
Yeah, and I'm really huge on making sure that it's a mutual fit. Like that's
Mm,
really important to me.
yeah,
I don't go into interviews with like I'm not holding onto a lever waiting to like
yeah,
one wrong answer and I like and you're through
yeah,
the trap door. Like
yeah,
I'm the cheerleader for everybody that comes in. I'm rooting for everybody that I
yeah,
interview. But it has to be a mutual fit. So I'm often looking for, is this how can I grow you? How can I help
mm,
enable you to grow and mature and become more of who you want to be as a designer?
mm,
And so I'm often, listening for questions about, what's the opportunity for growth. I really want to hear questions about what is the culture of the team in terms of, whatever matters to you. But is there a critique culture?
mm,
Do we get together, off, off grid or
yeah,
offline? How does that happen? Those kinds of things. Um, I'm also listening for, are you asking questions about the business? Are you
mm,
asking questions about what metrics you're held to? Are you held to any metrics?
Mm.
Um, when you're designing, and how are those things determined? And do you have a say in how those are determined? Not every company does,
Yeah.
few do, but we do. And so I think it's really important. I'm looking for designers that are going to come in and are
Yeah.
going to have a say and want to have a say
Yeah.
in how we push those metrics forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a big thing that I try and help designers with as much as possible when I'm speaking to them about the interview process and trying to prepare them for the interview. Because I think the interview, as much as I want it to be, I think it should always be like especially I think the introductory one, right? The introductory call where you
Yeah.
get to know each other for that first time. It should be just a really open and honest conversation about things, right?
Yes.
I think the more comfortable the hiring manager can make the candidate feel, the better you're going to get them performing in the interview, right?
100%.
Because they feel so much more comfortable. The pressure is instantly released, and they can talk freely. And they talk, as you said, more like the passive candidates that come in and know they've got a job and are really confident in that sense.
Right.
But I think the questioning that they ask the interviewer is often something they don't really consider that is, affects the way the interview goes. Because I think people have too much focus on I smashed all of the questions that they asked me, right? I think I gave like
Yeah.
really good answers to all the questions they asked me, and then I'll get the feedback from the client and say, yeah, like they answered all our questions well, but they didn't really ask too many questions to me, and it didn't really seem like they cared. I think the common perception that you get from someone that doesn't ask any questions or doesn't ask very detailed or very intuitive questions is that they're not really bothered. They don't really care too much specifically for our company, right? And I
Yeah.
think that if you want, especially for the jobs you really want to get, I always advise everyone I work with, go away and sit down and probably come up with like 10 questions that you
Yeah.
think you want to ask during this interview process. Now you might not get to ask them all during the call. I think it's good to have them written down in front of you so that if you haven't asked
Yeah.
them, then ask them at a later date.
Right.
But these questions should cover off all different areas. It should be team, culture, company, product,
Yes.
growth. You should cover off as much as you possibly can, because essentially you are interviewing this company to be your potential future employer, right?
Right.
I think it's such a common mistake that designers make, is that, or anyone makes in interviews generally, but it's just
Yeah.
don't focus too much on how well you answer their questions. Of course, try and smash it as much as you can, but
Yeah.
come as prepared as you can with your own questions to show that you do really care about your potential role at this new company.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, it's a two-way street, and I think that's the thing a lot of people forget, particularly in the US. I
Mm.
mean, I will say, I don't know how it is in Berlin. Berlin was amazing, by the way. I can't wait to go back. I'm really excited.
Yeah.
Um, but in the US, I mean, if your job, your healthcare is tied to your job.
Mm.
So much is tied to your job here. You can get yourself. It is easy to kind of get into this fear position where you're
Yeah.
like, I just need to get a job. I just need to get
Mm.
a job. And it's like, don't get yourself there. Don't get yourself there,
Mm.
because you probably can do better. Um,
Yeah.
so remain calm and ask those questions and make sure that this feels like the right situation for you. And if you
Yeah.
are getting like that tingling feeling of like, like I didn't like that interaction,
Mm.
or I didn't like the way that they answered that, like take that. Don't just
Yeah.
discount it. It means something.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just, yes, sometimes it becomes a little bit of a desperate situation, but try
Yeah.
your hardest not to fall into the trap of taking the first thing that comes.
Yeah.
I think design will always bounce back, the market will always bounce back.
Yeah. It will.
So yeah, there'll be plenty of opportunities in the future. But look, Sarah, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
For those of you who are watching below, I will put the link to Sarah's book on design systems for anyone to have a look at or purchase. I assume it's for purchase, right?
It is, and I have a
Yeah,
co-author, so
nice.
it's not
Yeah,
mine alone. Tori Davis is my
cool.
co-author, and she's
No
fantastic.
worries.
I don't wanna be a jerk, Tori, if you're
Yeah,
watching. She's like, "Wait a minute, it's not your book."
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Taking full credit for it. But yeah, look, again, Sarah, real pleasure. Make sure everyone tunes in for the next episode, which will be coming very shortly. But yeah, thanks very much, Sarah, and we'll
Yeah,
speak soon.
awesome. Thanks.